Thank you. 15 is the, but is it a countdown or no? It's the time. Okay, that's fine. Do I need to pass the floor to another session or a break or how does it work? Okay. Just transfer it.
It's not Texas, no? It's
Texas.
Ah, yeah, Texas.
I'm doing
very nice.
45 degrees heat on Sunday and then Saturday. Okay, I think we can start. Hello, good afternoon everyone. My name is Paola Tamma. I'm a EU correspondent with the Financial Times based here in Brussels, and it's my pleasure to moderate today's panel on who pays and what gives, or how to reconcile the need for investment and economic sovereignty with limited fiscal space in Europe. And I have quite a great panel to discuss this topic. So I have Gilles Mourre, who is Head of Unit of Fiscal Policy and Surveillance at ECFIN, the Department of the European Commission in charge of fiscal policy, Dr. Clara Leonard, who is Managing Director and co-founder of Institut Avant-garde, and Tim Legierse, sorry for butchering your name, who is Counsellor on the MFF, the multi-annual budget, at the permanent representation of the Kingdom of the Netherlands here in Brussels. There will be some time for Q&A at the end, so do start thinking. But let's start to discuss what is really the problem. Is it a lack of money? Is it too much money being redirected in the wrong places? So Gilles, I will start with you. If you can tell me, in terms of the simultaneous demands for increased spending, whether that's for industrial policy, energy independence, defense, when governments say that EU fiscal rules are constraining their need for investment, do they have a point? Are they blaming the wrong constraint?
No, thank you very much. Actually, I mean, in the context of repeated geopolitical shocks, what could be the role of fiscal policy and fiscal rule, and what you mentioned actually, the fact that fiscal rule are often considered to be a constraint to spending more, but actually this is not what fiscal rule are really about. Fiscal rule are not the constraint. Fiscal rule are actually a safeguard to debt sustainability risk. And if this risk materialize, this will mean less growth and more uncertainty and ultimately less ability to spend. So we know, I mean, episode of unsustainable public finance has led actually to crowding out investment and productive spending. So you might see fiscal rule actually contributed to a public good which correspond to macroeconomic stability, and without it you won't have investment, you won't have spending where is needed, and you will have actually extreme market volatility. So you have to consider fiscal rule as the first line of defense. And second, I think the constraint to productive spending are not of fiscal nature in many cases, or is not the prime, let's say, constraint. I mean, those constraints of broader structural nature, I mean, be it policy design, choice of investment pipeline, investment management, and so forth. So this is important. And let me basically just recall what the new fiscal rule, because fiscal rule has been revised back in 2024, and member states are implementing those. What this reform says, it said basically just two things. He said that we should have clear operational indicator, net expenditure indicator, which actually which define budgetary constraints so that debt is put on a downward path. So really, the definition of sustainability is a direction of travel. Debt cannot go up permanently. So this is the first basically point. And of course, member state who doesn't have as less constraint, more fiscal space, can use it to invest. So this is also the good news. There are some member states who can spend more, so they are not obliged to consolidate. The second point is actually this fiscal constraint should be agreed and committed to by member states in a medium-term plan within a kind of contractual approach. So the reform is not only to anchor basically fiscal route on debt dynamic, but it's also to improve governance by having a kind of contractual agreement with member states. And the more this contractual agreement is known, and is not a bureaucratic, let's say, arrangement, the more it is to foster a debate in basically the different capitals. That I leave it at that.
Thanks. We're going to come back to the increased flexibilities in the framework, the subsequent ones for defense and for energy. But I wanted to just ask you and either of the other panelists if they want to come in on this as well. It is early days because, as you said, the new fiscal rules are mandating a direction of travel over a number of years. But initial indication, both from your assessment of the Commission last year, from the European Fiscal Board and the ECB, do say, well, actually, debts and deficits are going to increase on average in the Eurozone. There are a significant number of countries that are already deviating from their paths. So is the framework fit for purpose, or are the conditions just calling for this fiscal response? If you can just give me a...
No, I can. You're absolutely right. Actually, what you are saying is actually
Your mic, sorry.
No. We can reply to your question, but what you are saying, and very rightly, is that the context actually prove the need for fiscal rule, because indeed our forecast, I mean the fiscal space, is at the current juncture basically smaller than what we thought. So debt is on the rise. The cost of debt servicing is higher. In some countries, actually, it could exceed the budget of education, for instance, just to give a striking example. And it's true that we are in the context where there is a growing spending needs at the same time. So in a way, having a careful management, is my mic... Okay, a careful management of a fiscal policy is important. So what you were saying is actually that fiscal rule, I mean, are not delivering debt reduction. I think yes and no. I mean, debt reduction, what the rules say is you need 4 years or 7 years, depending whether you want to use investment and reform to underpin an extension of the adjustment period. But debt is why we had a problem with the debt rule before. Debt cannot be reduced overnight. It's a process where you reduce social deficit up to a point up to a tipping point where debt is going down. So a condition is certainly to stick to your net expenditure path. But of course, there could be reason, and we will discuss it in the why we could give flexibility to member states, but this would be just a delay of this adjustment need. And it's true that the first, let's say, taking a step back, the first 2 years of implementation has been really good. All member states had a plan, and the plan discussion, the plan adoption was relatively smooth. Member states for 2025 has been relatively sticking to their plan. There is risk going ahead. There will be some delay due to the flexibility on defense, but it will be only delay. Just what I want to say is that you cannot curb that overnight. It's a process. So it's clear that we will manage to, sticking to the path is actually the way. What could happen is also bad news. So basically, you craft a plan, and the plan is based on macroeconomic assumption. And this macroeconomic assumption turn out to be very favorable compared to the reality. It could happen. But what we want is actually a measure of fiscal effort by the government. Mm-hmm. And it's why that it's a blend of it's an outcome, is the outcome of a fiscal effort and a fiscal orientation of the policy, but of the budget, but it's also, capturing every macro effect in the world. So it's why I think we have to stick with a plan which give a measure of the fiscal effort. But it's a repeated game. So after 4 years, you have a new plan, and this new plan actually will take stock of the reality. Some member states will have debt dynamic which is more favorable, so they will regain fiscal space. Other will have to make more effort. So in a way, with debt, what is important with this reform is debt does not lie. Debt has a full memory. It's not a conventional number like an MTO, medium-term fiscal objective. You miss it, tant pis, let's bygone be bygone. So in a way, there will be a repeated game, and in the repeated game, we will have the possibility to take a step back and to say why debt was larger. But what will be important is, as member states, don't bear effort. Yeah. Because you could have actually a debt reduction is nominal strategy with no effort if you're very favorable circumstances. But we know that this is not sustainable, because I think favorable circumstances are not forever.
Thanks for that. And Clara, if you want to react to these points, please go ahead. But I wanted to zoom out a little bit and ask you, you have long argued that the issue is not a shortage of money for investment, but perhaps a lack of good allocation. So what are the missing policy tools in the EU arsenal? We talked about fiscal rules, we will talk about the MFF, but what can and should the EU do in order to either mobilize the trillions of savings sitting on saving accounts, or create the space needed at the fiscal level for investments?
Okay, thank you for your question. So first time I will maybe zoom out a little bit and explain why I think we have good news and bad news when we analyze the situation. So as you said, the good news is that Europe does not have a money problem. So we focus a lot on the fiscal space. Some countries have limited fiscal space, but others don't. The room exists where we have the will to spend at a European space for common goods, but more importantly, the savings are there. So Euro area households save 15% of their disposable income, well above the US rate, and sit on close to 35 trillion in financial assets. So it's huge. Europe is among the world's most diligent savers. So that's the good news. But I have quite a lot of bad news. So first, the message I really want to emphasize on today is that the situation is very special in a bad way, and the investments, the existential investments that we have to make are tricky. They are not like past industrial revolutions for 4 reasons. So the first reason is the magnitude of the investments. So to deliver decarbonation, the digital transition, defense spending, and so on, annual investment will need to rise by provide 5% of European GDP. By comparison, historically, the Marshall Plan, for example, that was a huge plan, it was between 1 and 2% of GDP. So initially, in the Draghi report, he evaluated those investments at 800 billion yearly investment, and it has been increased again to 1,200 billion because of the defense spending. So first, this magnitude has never been experienced historically. Second difficulty is the pace. So not only those investments are huge, but they have to be done in an emergency, because the longer we wait, the greater the future damages will be. I'm talking obviously about climate damages, but I'm also talking about resilience toward future crises. If tomorrow, a country attacks us, what can we do? So we have less than 25 years to 2050, or European emission target, a single generation, whereas France's industrialization, for example, it took a better part of the 19th century. Third specificity, which is probably the most important, and I have to talk about that before talking about the solution, is that a lot of those investments are risky, and some of them are not even profitable. And that's a major difference with the historical situation. And also they have investment profiles that are different from the historical investment, because it's much more long-term. So for example, you have a paper from France Stratégie, so the French government think tank, that finds, for instance, that all the investment needed in France in buildings and transportation, only a third would be profitable without public intervention. So that's tiny. And this is even a conclusion from the private sector itself. So you have a McKinsey study that is looking at all of the transition investment, and they say that only 50% of those investments have a business case. So the real difficulty today is that, unlike post-war planning, for example, you have to designate losers and manage stranded assets. So the first specificity of our situation, if we want to devise the right tools and the right response, is that markets won't accommodate those investments by themselves just by doing, for example, the capital market union, but and the technology won't also by itself, in a Schumpeterian dynamic, accommodate those investments by themselves. So that's my analysis of the situation. Maybe I can talk about the solutions if you want.
Yes,
okay.
Please.
So I think the debate right now is very focused on two things. The first thing is the fiscal capacity. So you have on the one hand the people who think that we should reduce the deficit in order to have the space to do those investments. And on the other hand, the people who think, oh, it's okay to increase a bit the public debt and we'll finance it through debt and so on. On the other hand, you have people, and I think it's the line of the Draghi report, who think that it's going to be enough to reduce market fragmentation, and that once we have done that, the private capital will naturally go towards those investments. But for all of the reasons I've mentioned, it's not going to be the case. But those two debates are ignoring totally a large set of tools that have been historically used to steer and direct credit in a much more effective way towards the existential needs we are talking about. What is interesting is that, I can come back to that later, but China and the US are already doing it in a much more proactive way than we do. So when I'm talking about directing credit, I'm talking about, for example, the role of public banks. So right now, the public banks have a lot of capacity, and they are not directed enough towards those investments, and the risk profile of the investment they do is not the right one to accommodate those investments. It was mentioned in the Draghi report, but I saw very few people emphasizing on that and working on that, and I think that should be a key point. And the second point is the ECB policy. There have been a lot of work on how to differentiate the ECB policy, for example, having differentiated rates in function of what the banks finance. And we will face increasingly a dilemma between hiking rates in the short term to avoid inflation expectation to increase and so on, and preventing the private capital to go towards those essential investments. So That's my point.
Thank you. Very controversial preferential green rates, but let's turn to you, Tim. I think you share some of the analysis, but your answers are somewhat different. That fiscal constraints are not just legal ones, but primarily economic ones. It's just a question of does a country have the ability to invest into this environment? And the answer maybe is not to increase the size of the budget, whether that is at EU or national level, but to reprioritize. However, there are so many competing needs. We see that in the MFF debate, but we see that also in national debates around budgets, including the Netherlands, that call for very difficult political trade-offs. How do you, on the one hand, accommodate for these needs without causing a complete discontentment?
Yeah, that's a good question. Right, and I think that aligns very, very much with what Clara said on the magnitude of investment, because that not only begs the question, where does the money come from? And I agree that you need a lot of public money as well to crowd in private investment, but so we have the fiscal space problem. But I think given the magnitude of investment, but also because much of the investment that we now have to do will not grow our economies. It will be done to retain the status quo. And that's really depressing, but I think it needs to be said. So, of course, we need to spend more in defense and we have to do a lot of investments and we want to do more within Europe. So producing more within Europe relating to our sort of sovereignty or less dependence. But that will not grow our economy. Or at least it will not allow me to have more cups of coffee or go on holidays more often. So we have shifting activities that we need to take into account. Our economy needs to be doing different things. And similar for the green transition, it's very, very important to counter climate change. But I currently have energy and hot water. And then in 50 years' time, I will still have energy and hot water and nothing more, nothing less. And we have had to spend all this money and effort and investments in our economy to just retain the status quo. So a lot of the investments, I mean, I think when we had discussions on the fiscal rules, we at some point we still had the golden rule discussion. Shouldn't we just sort of carve out investments? And that makes a lot of sense if investments grow our economy. It makes a lot less sense if all of these investments are just being done to maintain the status quo. So I think that's fiscal space. So the big question is economic space. Who is going to do these investments? Who is going to be in our army? Who is going to build the barracks? Who is going to build the guns? If we want to do it all in Europe, and what's going to give in the economy? So I'm a Dutch civil servant, so you will always expect me to say we need to make tough budgetary choices and we need to reform. So here it is. And I truly stand by that. But it's even more important now because if you don't choose within your government budget, and we would say, okay, just put it into debt or just push all this money, additional money, which is massive, just push it into the economy. And you don't choose in your budget where the activity is going to be less or which people you're going to tax, then the economy is going to choose for itself. So if I would be a policymaker or a politician, and I know this is easier said than done because there's a lot of, I mean, this is going to be about sort of vested interests and people are used to stuff. But in principle, it should be more attractive if you're a politician to make the choices where your economy is going to adjust by adjusting it within your budget, compared to just pushing a lot of money into the economy that it cannot absorb and then see what happens. Are we going to buy the things abroad? No, because we wanted to make them at home. Are we going to just pay more because of higher inflation, because scarcity? That's a very unattractive proposition. And then you can say, okay, we paid a lot of more, so we met our defense targets, but we just were paying more for the same tanks and bullets. That's also not really very attractive. And if you're, and it depends a bit on your country, but if we need more military people in a military service, who is going to take care of my grandmother in the hospital? So all these choices, in principle, if you sort of keep track of your budget and you make the right choices, at least you are making the choices and you're not being confronted with an economy that will adjust on its own and you sort of lose grip of what you need to do. So I think the economic space is also severely lacking in many countries, apart from the budget space, and that's just apart from the debt dynamics and the debt sustainability considerations, I would say should be, I'm still working on the pitch. I mean, I'm not seeing people cheering yet, but that should be more than enough reason for politicians and policymakers to say, let's make these choices ourselves versus let the economy see where we end up.
Let me just come back on a point you said. These investments are not growing the size of the pie. They're taking us to, eventually, if we do them, to where we are, retaining security in Europe, having a hot shower and warm home. However, what about the opportunity cost of not doing this investment? Yeah. This is obviously something that, as a politician, probably you need to also take into account. And specifically on something that Clara said, that the fiscal space can be there if certain public goods are provided at a European level. So there's been a lot of talk of potentially a safe 2.0, so another round of loans for defense. There is always the discussion on a European safe asset and completing the fiscal and monetary union. And we know the normal Dutch position on this, but I would like you to engage with, have we reached the limit of what, given the constraints on national budget, what can be done in the current framework, institutional framework in Europe? Is there a need for an open discussion, whether or not the Dutch position will still be no thanks, no more debt, about other tools, specifically fiscal or investment-based, but also, you know, the MFF.
Yeah, I think if I reason from, I mean, I operate within the Dutch political constraints, and we have a very sort of predictable parliament, I would say. So my work is always very easy.
It's the country most constrained by its own parliament that I know of.
And I think the issue is here that even if it were to be true, and if it would be very, and I fully agree that we need to make this choice. The Dutch answer is you reprioritize to make the right decisions, and you don't put it on top of everything else.
So still at national level, not necessarily at European.
Well, it's going to be quite hard, at least politically in the Netherlands, if we see room, and we often see it, for policy choices to be made within national budgets, and if we perceive ourselves to be making these tough budgetary choices, and we do, I think, then it is going to be very hard politically to say, okay, we make the choices, we fit it into our budgets, but other people or other countries apparently are not able to. So it's hard to sell us on the ability, on the disability of other countries to make tough budgetary choices. And I mean, of course, we're fully aware of political economy and political dynamics, but the argument that we think that there are a lot of options to improve your budget, to improve the quality of spending, to improve the quality of income, and make the right choices, will mean that that's sort of, from the Dutch perspective, always the first best policy to do. And I think if, as policymakers, we always look at the first best policy and not at the sort of the second best policy.
But isn't there, I mean, I remember a few months ago, Bruegel had a paper trying to define what could be a new model for creation of and ownership of, for instance, defense assets, and saying it could be retained at the European level. You could have joint ownership, because also precisely as you said, both because we want things to be more made in Europe, but also because the economies of scale of putting together the orders of 27 countries for tanks and whatever it is, you know, we can make the same case for other public goods, are just there. So, you know, I don't necessarily see this as a shift in the responsibility for member states to do tough choices. Maybe there is an economic efficiency case for certain goods to be provided at the European level.
And I think for SAFE, this was one of the reasons why, I mean, it's always reluctantly, but then eventually sometimes reluctantly, the Netherlands agrees to certain debt-based instruments. The SAFE was the same. We saw the acute need, and we saw the potential that SAFE would garner cooperation and joint purchasing. Of course, the problem is then we did this exemption in SAFE, and everyone and everyone is buying their own stuff now. But the dream was there for SAFE, that it would actually lead to European cooperation. It's still the same. If there's an economic case there, then the Dutch will still say, but why do we need to force this with a debt instrument if the incentive should already be there in terms if it's just common sense to do it together? Okay. That's a bit of the issue.
Gilles, let me come back to you. We said we will come back to the flexibility, and I do want to go there. The first one was triggered partly by Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the need for rearmament, disengagement, partial disengagement from the US. So we need to invest more in defense. There is need to make room for that in national budgets. A majority of member states have taken up that flexibility. And then very recently, the Commission has extended that to certain kinds of energy investments as well, to deal with the spike in prices for energy due to the Middle East war. Now, my question there is, where do you draw the line between what is current expenditure? Because arguably, it's not just about buying the jets and buying the drones, but actually having those pensions for the army and so on. So it's an actual sustained fiscal effort. And similarly for energy, yes, investment in decarbonization and trying to become more energy independent are needed, but they're needed on such a scale that the 0.3% over a number of years is just not going to cut it. So where do you draw the line on investment, which do there is a case, what we were discussing earlier, for maybe exempting them from fiscal rules, and current expenditure?
Oh, thank you. This is a very important question. So actually, as I will go toward a point made by Tim. Clearly, we will have no choice to face the quality of public finance. So I don't think that all investment policy is fiscal, and but the second point is everything is choices and trade-off. And I think, member states are a very heterogeneous situation. Some have more fiscal space than others, and this heterogeneity would need to be reduced. But at some point, you will have to, some member states will have to adjust, but will have also to revisit their budget and to revisit their priority. And so the importance of quality of public finance, it's great. It has a lot of dimension, but you could say one of the key dimensions is spending reprioritization and spending efficiency. So with the same type of, one is, could we spend better elsewhere? And the second question is actually, with the same envelope on one sector, could we have more value for money with, and could we make some saving, or with the same amount get more value for money? And this is a difficult conversation. It's outside the fiscal rule. But in the case of defense, we could have said, in the case of defense and energy, try to improve the quality of public finance. It's easier said than done. It takes time. So here there were the realization that we need to manage a transition to a steady state. Let's say, and for defense, we were saying, member states need to build up defense. This will have some cost, and the cost will be front-loaded, so we should help by basically providing, in a way, some extra time. So basically, you give extra time for member states to reach the point where debt is on the downward path. But make no mistake, this is costly also for the member states, because when debt accumulates, the cost of debt servicing increase. So it's a principle of reality, but we are not saying, please spend, spend, spend. You say you have an allowance and you use it wisely. It was the same for energy. And energy, I think the framing was very important, like in defense. So in defense, we have framing in time, managing transition, framing in scope, defense. Now energy security and resilience, so it's part of the same logic. and framing in scope, in amount with the capping. So it's really constraining, and of course, member states need to see how they square with their it's another ones. But at the end of the day, after the 4 years where you grant the flexibility, you will have to sustain permanently higher level of defense. So what we're managing is a transition. And the case of quality of public finance, will be even stronger. And quality of public finance, okay, let's try to shift your spending to more friendly item. Okay, but now with defense as a public good, in a way, it's there. Defense will increase, so you will have to make space. You like it or not. While some member states will have fiscal space and will not need to use flexibility, but others will have less fiscal space. And so we are not sending cut. We are sending those who have fiscal space could use it. It's a choice. Mm-hmm. And then I think, and Clara and team were hinting to this. I mean, more than hinting at it. I mean, you spend, and you need to spend well. So it's not only fiscal; it's about policy design, and it's why. Here we need to give a rope to member states, but nudge them toward R&D spending, investment. You will need current spending. You will need ammunition. You will need, basically the message of SAFE, for instance, was to say, we give you we give you money, but there is a string attached. So there is conditionality of the origin. So 60%. You retain, if you contract with third party, which is possible, you retain actually the design. So there is an industrial property element. And you do it together. You do it European. So in the first year, because Tim said that we didn't spend European because there was a waiver for the first year, but the purpose of the SAFE plan is actually to foster a joint procurement, which is a bit of revolution, bringing the demand together so that we could have more unification of the supply. This is a kind of revolution. I mean, defense has always been outside the remit of the single market. Now, it's getting closer. So you see, I mean, it's like in the quality of public finance at national level. I think in a way the key of the success will be not only to be able to spend but the spending will increase, that it will be about good policy. And so what you said about investment is very important. We know has been some paper by Peter Sorico, for instance, in the American Economic Review of the importance of defense R&D as a spillover on the civil society and on growth. But you will need to indeed make this effort. You will need also to manage the transition so that at the end of the flexibility, you don't fall back to low level of defense. But here there is good news on the quality of public finance, and we have to also say it. Since COVID, and I think RRF was probably part of the story, and investment has increased. Investment was clearly below the 3%, so basically the capital depreciation now is above. And not only due to RF, but also nationally financed investment. And now with defense, we have an indication that defense in our forecast will increase by 0.2%, by half of a point of GDP in 2 years. And this has to be, of course, monitored. But investment is also increasing. So this is a good news. The total stock of investment, just before the crisis, investment, so in 2019-18, investment was at its lower point. Why? We didn't have austerity at all. So investment, it's a secular decline, was due to something more structural, is the point made by Clara. And it depends also policy choice on policy and not only on spending. So just to summarize your question, actually it's an overlap of our basically our discussion. I mean, you have to face hard choice concerning spending. And you could have flexibility and it could help temporarily, but in the long run, we are in the world of trade-off. And to policy matter is as important as how much you spend. It's important to also know how well you spend, and spending together, as Tim has said, is clearly on defense, for instance, part of the equation, and it's part of a mental revolution. I mean, imagine a safe proposal 5 years ago, back in 2018. It would have been considered as sci-fi to have this discussion, you know. So things are moving, but very speed limit.
Thank you. Clara, I wanted to come back to something you initially said. So the dormant amount of savings. And I think, if I understood you, there is a bit of a fallacious argument that, you know, since we don't have that much width of fiscal space, then let's mobilize private money. But private capital does not always flow where we need it to go. However, I do want to ask you, there are things which Europe is trying to do with the Saving and Investment Union, trying to move forward a 15-year-old agenda on completing the banking union and so on. But could it do more in terms of both at the EU level or national level to mobilize this savings into productive investment? And you mentioned it earlier, but can you tell me like 2 or 3 areas which you think there for sure there is no private case for investment, and there for sure we need something at a European level?
Okay, so first of all, what I want to say that everything that we are doing on the savings and investment.
Mike, sorry.
Sorry, can you hear me? Yes. So what we are doing on the Saving and Investment Union and so on, it's absolutely necessary. Those things are not exclusive, but the problem is when you think it's the end game and it's going to be enough by itself. What I found is that I looked at a lot of historical cases of efficient policies of steering credit and so on, and I compared it to what the EU is doing right now. What is fascinating is that to some extent, the EU is already trying to steer credit. So, for example, the EIB lends for the Green Deal, the ECB tilted its corporate bond purchases, and so on and so on. But right now, the problem is not really the tools. They are already in the toolbox, but we have a real coordination problem, and also we have a wording problem. I mean, we refuse to use the word of steering credit because it's a bad word, because it's associated with a French post-war planning that was a very, very state control. It's associated to China, that is a non-democratic country. So the word has a bad reputation. But actually, if you look historically, you have many examples that are much more progressist and where you can have an open economy and at the same time steering credit. So for me, the priority is not so much creating a lot of new tools, but it's recognizing that we have to do it, because not mentioning it creates a lack of ambition in the tools, a lack of coordination, and a lack of discussion on strategic priorities and who is going to take the risk and who's going to pay. This is a discussion we're not having clearly, and we have to integrate that in a planning tool, a European planning tool and national planning tools that are compatible with our market system. The idea is not to become China. So yes, I was telling you about some concrete example. So I'm going to talk about France. So for example, in France, we have the BPI. So it's one of the big public banks. There have been a lot of reports on the fact that the funds are not controlled enough. There is not ex post evaluation where you can say exactly if it has been efficient versus the objective. It's not cooperating with the planning agencies that that we have. So there is absolutely no coordination to say, okay, you have to finance X billion for defense, X billion for energy, X billion for that. So it's already very chaotic and poorly coordinated. In terms of what we have to finance, I think there is some space for some very risky innovation investments where the state can put little money and have a lot of also profitability in the long term. So you have also a historical example of small public venture capitals that are working really well. So that's quite interesting, but it's going to be a tiny amount of money. And then what we should not finance is obviously where there have been a lot of startups that have been financed and that completely failed and that are not in the existential investment. A striking case is, for example, the insect startup financed by BPI. So basically, it was about doing food with insects, and it was a massive loss of money, and it has no no connection with everything that we are talking about.
Thank you. Big headlines. And team, I want to bring the discussion to the EU budget because you see some of those tensions playing out. You see the tension between, let's call it current expenditure, or at least like constituency expenditure in what is the first pillar. So that's where the traditional policies of the EU budget are financed, cohesion and agriculture. And then you have a new, innovative and bigger, proportionally, European Competitiveness Fund. And there is a tension there about, how should it be distributed? How strong should be the merit-based criteria? Or should there be some geographical balance? But also in that second pillar of the budget, there are suggestions for instruments which leverage the budget for coordinating, directing private investment. European Scale-up Fund, a new version of the IIF, and so on. So to what extent can the EU budget be used to leverage private investment? And do you have hope, since you're the one negotiating it for the Netherlands, that eventually what we'll end up with will be able to do that?
Yes, we certainly have hope, and the core of the sort of the Dutch position on the MFF is increase what we then call heading 2. That's the competitiveness part of the budget. And then, of course, I'm Dutch, so I have to say it needs to come at the expense of something because we need to choose. So that's then heading 1 for us. So we need to lower on cohesion and agriculture, and for the benefit of competitiveness, because it's just a matter of making choices. Of course, what we see is that there's a lot of pressure, from some countries, including mine, to lower the budget, and then what we've seen the Cypriotic presidency do is lower it in the wrong place from our perspective. So heading 2 has been cut by a little bit. So that's a bit problematic. But within heading 2, I think it's good to say it's not just the European Competitiveness Fund. It's also still very much Horizon, which is next to it. And I think in the current context, even more so than previously, both for sort of the green transition and for defense and security, we have the Connecting Europe facility. So I think those are 3 very core parts of heading 2. A lot of the focus is on the ECF, similarly to the need to make that as big as possible within the financial constraints that we face. We are also, but I think that's widely the perception in the Council, that we need to increase the InvestEU part to ensure that we leverage private capital. And then within InvestEU, I think there's also consensus that InvestEU should take on more risk. So it should be more, and it should be more risk-taking. And hopefully with all the lessons that Clara just explained, please look at what you do exactly. I think one of the worries that I have going into this, I mean, I'm very happy that my instructions from Den Haag are, say, make InvestEU bigger and make it more risky. I also see the headlines in the Telegraaf in sort of, it's a lot of years, 10 years time, say, with examples where the EU put in money and lost big time on something that, in the benefit of hindsight, was maybe not the best choice. So hopefully our politicians will sort of be ballsy enough to say, no, we said it needed to be bigger and it needed to be more risky, because for each euro we put in, we want to have more bang for our buck. And then that also always means losing money at certain places. Otherwise, that's the whole point of risk taking. And I think maybe that's even sort of, if you broaden it to society in Europe, that's maybe even a question. Because I mean, Clara, you just asked who's going to bear the risk. Yeah, that's the good question. And sort of from my sort of personal standpoint with this capital market union, I'm always thinking, oh yeah, so I have all my money in the bank. That's a problem. My boyfriend is putting everything in crypto. I think that's also a problem. so what to do? Find something.
Always the boyfriend.
Something in between. But seriously, I mean, I think I actually am in an okay place, because the Dutch government has forced me into mandatory pensions, who are probably taking a lot more risk than I'm aware of. So that's good. If you want to have more of that, obviously that's going to be a very long-term solution only, which is a bit of the depressive part. So I fully agree with, we need to do the capital market union, everything now, but we also need to be honest that for that to bear fruit is going to take maybe a bit too long for the discussions that we're having now. Maybe they're good for the discussion that we have in 10 or 20 years' time for the challenges that the world would then face. Imagine if you have to set up your sort of more private pensions now. That's really going to take quite some time, and the group of people that is sort of in the building up age is becoming smaller eventually. But then it does require people to have sort of a risk appetite. And I had planned to find a book maybe on this topic, or maybe, I mean, we're with a very broad group here. Maybe there are very good papers on sort of the risk appetite of the European consumer. Is it there? Is it not there? Does it have to do with income distribution? What's going on? And is that something that you can change with sort of the setup, with the capital market union? Or is it so ingrained culturally and that you're always sort of running into limits as to the amount of risk taking that people are willing to do? And if there's clear limits, then we're just never going to make it to the US, I would say.
Well, I'm convinced that Europeans save but don't invest, because we have a quite generous welfare states in most places, or at least that's the general sense of the analysis. And I'm one who saves but still has the money on the bank account, so I should know better, but I still haven't made that step. And then I wanted to come to the last round of questions about what has to give. We talked about the allocation of money and some of the policy trade-offs, but for me it's important, and we started just now to discuss who eventually foots the bill in terms of, is it across generations, or is it different groups? Is it taxpayers versus investors in case if it's risk, and how can policy make those decisions or help those decisions along? So we've talked a lot about Europe, but Clara, you have said at the very beginning, the US and China are doing some of those policies that allow them to invest at scale much more quickly, much more effectively from their point of view. What can we learn and what shouldn't we emulate when it comes to Europe's ability to distribute this risk and these costs?
So first about the US. So the US is a bit of a paradox, because we've been hearing for decades that the US is a model of a neoliberal free market economy. But if you're looking at the financing side and the financing of those big transformations, the public hand is literally everywhere. So federal agencies, for example, they don't just fund research, they take risk that private lenders won't take. The Energy Department Loan Office finance first of a kind project. It backs the first large-scale utility-scale solar farm and guaranteed $12 billion for the first new US nuclear reactor in over 30 years. Those are massive projects. The NASA and the Pentagon, their procurements have seeded entire industries by acting as guaranteed for first customer. So really, the state acts as a patient financier, like the private sector, and first resort. So we need to break with this idea that we need to be the US because it's a neoliberal economy, and we're just going to apply some theoretical view of what a neoliberal economy is. It's not true. It's true that when you look at market fragmentation, they have a bigger market, and this is really an important thing. But they also have all of those tools that have to be recognized. When we talk about China, it's interesting because they steer credit as well, but openly, and they go even further. So for the specificity of China, it's like France after the Second World War, is that the banking system is largely state-owned. So lending follows a national priority. I'm not saying this is what we have to do, but it's a specificity that also limits. So a foreign investor cannot often better terms and cannot compete with a subsidy backed by money creation. So that's the first point. And on top of that sits guidance. So the central bank and regulator use window guidance to channel lending to specific sectors. And what is really interesting, and I think we should think about that, is that increasingly the state directs capital through public guidance funds that take direct equity stakes into the strategic firms. So this equity financing thing is really interesting because it gives you even more impact. So we always talk about this the big fund, the Chinese big fund, that with a semiconductor with close to 100 billion in financing, but it's financing the semiconductor industry from the inside. And also something interesting about China is that they don't do like a French or European post-war planning where you had big champions. They actually finance big companies in key sectors, but then there is still a competition between those big companies that are financed by the public sector. So they have both the public support and this competition mechanism that is created some incentive to innovate and so on. So I think obviously you cannot copy and paste for all of the reasons I've said. It's a very non-democratic system, but there are some interesting mechanisms we should work on to see what we can do.
Thank you. So public demand in the US, massive driver for growth and investment, and potentially directing lending towards policy priorities.
And public procurement in the US, it's a very important thing.
Gilles, I want to come to something which is a big debate in the Commission, but at the European level, and that's about the trade-offs between economic efficiency, economic security. One of the areas in which this is panning out is public procurement, preference in public procurement, with the idea that we should be, giving a preference not necessarily to the cheapest goods out there, but potentially have some capabilities in Europe. Previously, we discussed this as being open strategic autonomy, then some reshoring, and now we're talking about European preference. Now, European preference has a cost, because as Tim was saying, you're not just going shopping for the best deal, you're going to shop for the deal with a flag on top. But in some cases, arguably, it is warranted. So even for open free trading nations like the Netherlands, there's a recognition that certain sectors, certain key components in certain supply chains should be available to us, or at least we should not depend on just one supplier. Where do you think Europe should, calibrate these two objectives, both not increasing too much the cost to taxpayers for public procurement, but increasing economic security, and how? Is it by growing it in Europe or just by diversifying our trading partners?
Well, thank you. It's a very interesting questions. I mean, it's a little bit outside the remit of my very expertise, but I could try to give some thought to this. So, the trade-off economic efficiency, economic security is not a trade-off. It's a trade-off because I think in a way before we have efficiency and the dividend of peace and the vision of harmonious globalized world, Here is not the case. So, I mean, we know that if we don't have security, it will be very difficult to have efficiency, because we will have a lot of uncertainty, which will impair growth. Investors are adverse. So if I don't think that, for instance, we could oppose, for instance, the prevention of cyber attack with efficiency. So it's linked. It's just adapting to our new geopolitical world, which is, I mean, in a way, a landslide corresponding to the time where I was a young adult after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And here, I think there is a need to be strategic. There is, for instance, with basically the friendly shoring, but there is also and the need to, I mean, on industry. I mean, now there is a kind of revival in industrial policy, but we should be very careful of not throwing the baby with the bath. We need to have this compatible also with competition policy, because then there is a risk, of course, of capture by interest. It's the tale of the two story. Basically, was it basically the Indonesian and car industry program, and compared to the Korean, South Korean car industry program. One gave rise to a most famous brand on earth. The second one, you don't even know about it, because actually it fell because of lack of competition. So the project was based on protectionism, strategic protectionism, but actually there were no competitions. So there has been basically a capture. So I think that a balance need to be found, but the friendly shoring is actually typically maintaining this kind of rule-based approach, competition, but in taking into account the fact that some of the partner is not sharing the same rule-based approach. And another important point indeed is the cost of security. So it may be a level shift, but let me come back to the fact that the reflex also, the good fiscal management is important, because we have sometimes the reflex to spend badly. I'm just taking a very concrete example. We are talking about energy crisis. Let's talk to energy crisis. 2022. In 22, basically we spent 1.2% of GDP in basically in supporting household and firms. And it was at the same figure in 23. If I'm correct, it was 1%. But in 22, only 0.5% was income support, and 0.3% was on targeted. Only 1/4 of it was targeted. Is what we see now with this crisis, with much lower amount. But actually, the reflex has been let's basically support demand, while the flexibility, for instance, if we take the case of the flexibility, has to be to orientate them to supply, build defense and defense capacity, basically take measure. Not, I mean, you could take a support measure, but you have to finance them. If you want to have the flexibility, you need to support actually decarbonization. You need to support energy security. We need to support. So you see the reflex. And if somebody can put on basically on put like a slide I have. I just want to say that when you have uncertainty, the problem is often that you want to spend more. But this slide is very illustrative. It's coming from our annual public finance report, public finance in MU. So I indulge in easy publicity, but it's a nice read. It's an extract from that. But it's interesting to see that actually when you are more uncertainty, and you were mentioning the case of security, I think you have a case also to rebuild buffer and not to spend. And for instance, let's take the first quadrant on the top left top. It shows that when you carry out strongly counter-cyclical policy, so for instance, you actually do some fiscal saving in good times when your output gap is positive, actually, and you do it for, let's say it's an average over 3 years, and the next 3 years are characterized by the possibility to actually run counter-cyclical policy, to spend more when you face bad time. And take the opposite quadrant on the bottom right. Actually, when you spend in good time, instead of saving in good time, actually you are running you are running pro-cyclical policy in bad time. So you have fiscal retrenchment while you need actually to spend in bad times. So in a way, the security is also the fiscal, let's say, prudence is also part of the security. I mean, some of our enemy would love to have that Europe face a financial crisis, for instance. This is a key public good we have to ensure, and it's true that if we're in uncertainty, there is a strong case of rebuilding buffer. And it's interesting, if you look at the dots, showing basically the magnitude of the cyclical fluctuation, you can see also that the dots are farther away the zero line. So there is basically some cyclical fluctuation which was stronger when you carry out strongly pro-cyclical policy, group 4, compared to group 1, where you carry out strongly counter-cyclical policy. So this is important. It's part. So in a way, the management of public finance is also part of this broad issue of security, and macroeconomic stability is part of it.
Thank you. I have one last question for Tim, but we'll be turning to questions from the audience in 4 minutes. Tim, I wanted you to come back on 2 points. One is the one I just asked Gilles. I do think that there is a bit of a trade-off between efficiency and security. One cannot, predict what the costs are if we only go with the efficiency argument. So arguably it's an unknown quantity, but you as and the Dutch government, where do you place the line for a need for increased security at the cost of some efficiency?
Yeah, I think, we clearly shifted a bit in terms of that we were really very market oriented, and there's clearly now the realization that there are limits to what the market can deliver, and that there are good reasons to sacrifice efficiency for the benefit of certainty. And that's a very hard choice, because you're not certain upfront on what you are sort of insuring against, and that's the big problem. But at least because the realization is there will be certain sectors or certain products where those choices will be made. Defense is a very clear and important topic there. But within sort of the whole spectrum of do everything on our own and sort of have full insurance against any outcome versus, well, let's just see what happens in the world. I think we're clearly pushing away from let's do everything ourselves and because that would be too costly eventually, probably. And one never really knows how the world then plays out. But upfront, sort of making a lot of choices that go against efficiency is a bit hard for the Netherlands, which is also why in the context of the ECF, the Competitiveness Fund, this is an important discussion, both in terms of EU preference, but also in terms of the way in which the Commission can do sort of quick projects that they deem essential immediately to do. Where we are saying, okay, you really need to have the right frame for this. So let's ensure that we really only sacrifice efficiency if we are if we are sure that this is sort of the right thing to do. And then, I mean, you never know. So I think as policymakers, you can only sort of have sort of make analysis of the risks, and then eventually, fortunately, then it's not our job because we chose other professions to sort of make the choice, because that's eventually going to be political. But for us, it's really still clearly very important to not do it all over the place, but really to see where the biggest risks are. And that also then entails that the other risks are still out there, but you are willing to take them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the most important aspect here for politicians is just to explain it and be honest about it.
Mm-hmm.
Because it doesn't really help if you say, okay, the world is going to be net better if you're going to lose out on efficiency. Then you can say, but we do this clearly because then we lower the risk that down the line we have a lower economy or a very large shock. So I think it's mostly about making choices now consciously and then also explaining.
Let me just take the question a little further on if we agree at a European level that X, Y, Z things should be in our hands, or at least in the hands of our trusted partner, whatever that is defined as. How do you distribute the costs at a European level for such a level for this choice? The increased cost from European preference in public procurement.
That's a good question. It's I think a bit outside of my mental space.
It's okay.
Let me see. But I'm not sure if, I mean, eventually most of the costs are not necessarily to be distributed, because the economy will play out in a way where eventually I will have less purchasing power for certain goods. So that's why I say more like the explanations are maybe more important than making conscious choices or on who is going to sort of bear the brunt of that. I mean, if certain goods or services are becoming more expensive in Europe, that's going to be the case for every one of us. Then the question becomes, are you going to do income policy to shield the lowest income brackets of that consequence? And that's then again a political choice where you have to make the choices. And that's something that politicians can do, I think, largely within countries, because that has a lot to do with national prioritization, as much as you need to make the choices within your budget currently and explain them very well, because then you're in the driver's seat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much. I would like to open the floor to questions. There's one at the back. Please activate your mic and say your name and who the question is for.
Thank you so much for the very interesting panel. I'm Francesco Zezza from University of Catania. I'm an applied macroeconomist. So I was quite surprised from part of the discussion on the fiscal rules. So last week, the ECB started a new hiking cycle. So increased the interest rate by 25 basis points. It will most probably continue to raise interest rates. This already puts a lot of pressure on debt sustainability. Then the new fiscal rules imply that most of the countries which are not reaching their target for the medium-term fiscal structural plan will embark in austerity. So we are leaving 2010 again. With a new round of austerity throughout Europe, especially in large countries, and dysfunctional monetary policies, because we are, raising rates in face of a supply shock, which is like counter to what Macro 01 will tell you. So why do you think this time will end up differently?
I guess the question is for Gilles or anyone. Okay. I'll allocate it, Gilles.
Okay, I made the hot seat. So you see, the new fiscal rules are actually setting a budgetary constraint to bring debt on the downward path. But in this budgetary constraint, his level is net expenditure, net of new spending. But he has some, let's say, a lot of buffer. Interest rate is outside the remit of the indicator. So interest rate, so member states, you don't need, I mean, it will morph into more debt, of course. So you will have to do further adjustment down the line. But during the lifetime of the plan, you don't have to adjust for the increase of interest rate. The indicator is left out of consideration your tax bill based on current law. So there will be the indicator will allow some kind of pro-cyclicality. So the indicator have some actually a buffer built into it. I mean, come on. I mean, we talk about austerity, but I mean, it has been very limited time where you have austerity. I mean, what is clear is the fiscal stance will be neutral to mildly expansionary. Is what the European is not coming from the Commission. It's coming from the Euro area. The European Fiscal Board was saying that the fiscal stance will be neutral toward mildly expansionary. Why? Because of the flexibility. So the spending in defense, which will be not considered, which actually you could deviate. It will allow a deviation from the budgetary constraint, from the net expenditure path. It will be the case for energy measure. Okay, you have the RF, which in 2006 will make a positive contribution to the fiscal stance. Let's not forget it. It was so. This is a really an important consideration, and some member states, and it was what Paola mentioned, have risk of not following strictly their budget constraint. So we cannot have it both ways. I mean, the debt need to decline on the medium term, but the fiscal stance will be supportive. So we will have a policy mix, which seems to be broadly appropriate, is our view. And you mentioned back the crisis, but let's take the case, for instance, if I'm correct, the case of some country. I mean, I won't name any country, but some country have to consolidate, I mean, twice as much as the rule we're telling you, and because of the market pressure. So it was, we had a confidence crisis here. So I think this need to be borne in mind. I mean, really austerity. I mean, I heard a lot of case where there is austerity in my country. No, the country is actually spending a lot, and that is accumulated. So I just want to also say that in the world of more frequent shocks, and there is a big list, we could add AI and an energy shock, COVID shock. So we have two. So we need also to make sure that debt is under control and restore fiscal space. And this is very important because I mean, shocks will be with us, and we need to also cater for that and not shift the burden to the next generation. This is also a key element of equity, is intergeneration equity. So I want to just a little bit nuance the criticism here.
It's complicated to get a Commission official to comment on ECB policy. There, please.
Thank you for this very interesting panel. I'm Stan Jordan, Sustainable Finance Lab, a Dutch think tank, but I'm actually a French imposter working with your Dutch colleagues. But a question for you, Tim. I think, obviously fiscal discipline is the cornerstone of the issue, right? In terms of if you want more common borrowing or this type of things. I think let's look at it like right now, what the Commission has is only sticks, down the line, penalties, whatever, and maybe some very soft form of incentives for, country-specific recommendations and so on. But we know this is not working. I mean, every time I speak to colleagues in the ECFIN, they lament about, the fact that, what can they do really to push governments to do the right reforms? So I think we should flip the coin a little bit on that, and I think it's a fallacy to think that a common borrowing will just be about giving a free lunch to member states. You know, the day after you introduced more common borrowing or whatever, it will come with condition attached. The RRF discussion, that was the landing zone. And I think so the question is like, is it not the case as well that having more common borrowing for investments, both EU level public goods and also to some degree to also national led program, you know, in a way it changes the conversation. You know, in France right now, in many countries, I suspect the way this whole conversation is seen is like, oh, we need to make a pension reform just to make the financial markets happy and to make the EU technocracy happy. That's the point. That's the discussion right now. This is the narrative. I don't think we're gonna get anywhere with this narrative. So I think at some point, if the EU provides not just sticks but also carrots.
So your question is,
my question is like, under what condition would the Dutch, not just the Dutch government in general, but the Dutch narrative could start engaging on that, on what kind of fiscal discipline we should put in place together with common borrowing, because then that the conversation I think helps both sides of North and South, if you want to put it that way. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess that's the million-dollar question. One of the issues that I usually have when I mean, there are many papers on common borrowing and Eurobonds and whichever form it takes, and then to cater for the sort of the hang-ups that Dutch politics have with that, usually then those papers say, and then to cater for sort of moral hazard or the risk of free lunch or whatever, we'll just ensure that those countries stick to the fiscal rules. And to be honest, I've never seen any of those papers expand beyond that and give me a credible explanation of how that is actually going to happen, where fiscal policy is clearly the prerogative of national politics within the limits of the fiscal rules of Gilles. And there, I think one of the things, my historical reconstruction of what happened in the Netherlands is that in 1992 we thought we had a very sort of strict deal on EMU. So we had no excessive deficits, we had no monetary financing, we had the no bailout clause. No one knew what it meant. Huh? It was just language. And over time we have sort of learned what it meant. And I think one of the more famous Dutch parliamentarians at some point said, and I think that's the crux of the issue, if we would have known in 1992 that the no bailout clause was apparently this flexible, and that no monetary sort of the prohibition of monetary financing, which is nowhere to be found, it's very concrete language. But if this is apparently what the ECB can still do, and if this is how we avoid excessive deficits, we would have never signed up. So that's sort of what is ingrained in Dutch politics, is my reconstruction that we thought we had another Maastricht treaty than it apparently turned out to be, where the Netherlands thought there was a very serious sort of agreement within the treaties on fiscal discipline that never really played out. And then it becomes very problematic when from the Dutch perspective, countries did not make the necessary choices, and that's both in the budgets and in terms of economic reform, where then eventually those countries run into fiscal problems or a lack of fiscal space, and then we say, okay, but then we need the solution is Europe. I think if everyone would be in a sense sort of in the fiscal situation that we apparently dreamed of in 1992, then the discussion on common borrowing would probably be much easier, because then you can sort of focus the discussion entirely on, we currently have a common challenge that we want to face commonly, but we cannot, and I'm just explaining Dutch politics, we cannot have that discussion because the dominant frame is we ought not to have been in this situation. And I haven't found any way to get out of that frame. So.
Quite negative. Question.
to both Gilles and Tim. Thank you, first of all, for this tour de force through so many topics. I have a question on fiscal, and I'm Philippa Siegel-Glöckner, head of Dezernat Zukunft, so we work a lot on the German budget and defense expenditures and all of that. And I share many of your views on, you know, especially burden sharing between generations, efficiency of expenditures and all of that, especially with what we see at the moment. But honestly, I'm missing a little bit of budgetary realism, because there's just absolutely no way we're gonna, you know, basically create enough fiscal space for the level of the defense expenditures we're going towards with prioritizing and efficiency gains, if by prioritizing we mean something other than cutting everything we can cut. I mean, probably even with that, it's not going to work. We're talking about, you know, sums of the magnitudes of like 150 billion, which need to come out of a budget of around 400 billion if you take out, you know, defense expenditures and some of the investments that you probably want to do. This does not work. Also, when you look historically, I disagree a little bit with you, Tim, that, you know, you have to make the choice, otherwise the economy makes it for you. I mean, that you have, you know, if your economy is running at full capacity, but this is not the case in Germany. We actually have a little bit of a problem. We could use more demand. And Christoph Trebisch from Kiel has written this big paper on defense expenditure and how they've been financed. And half of the financing has historically come from debt if you had peacetime spending booms. Now, I really, really hope that we don't need to spend that much on defense, you know, in the medium term. But I think the whole idea that all of this is going to come out of current expenditures without borrowing is a fantasy, even though I would like it, because I don't think it's intergenerationally just to have all of this, or a lot of this, coming out of borrowing. But I just don't see it happening. And I really also don't see the German debt stock falling. I think there's got to be a lot of creativity in DSAs to make this work. So yeah, I just wonder how you see that situation, and whether, you know, the right thing for Germany, because this is what we're heading towards, is really to cut on everything, like, you know, education, language classes, early childhood stuff, in order to make space for defense expenditures. I mean, to me, this sounds crazy.
Yeah, fair point. And indeed, I'm reasoning from the Dutch perspective, where we think, I think we are still pretty much at full capacity. Maybe we're falling a bit below now. And there, you run into the sort of the economic limits. And eventually, because the boost is so big, if you're successful, then eventually I think even Germany might win. And then, and you have but that's okay, fair enough. Only on the expenditure side, I also see that that is going to be very hard. Taxes are not very attractive because of the economic impact, but there is still a lot of room for maneuver, at least in the Netherlands. Also on, I mean, Gilles has stressed the quality of spending, but there's also the quality of income, and that's even, I mean, that's sometimes even harder politically, because that runs into a lot of vested interests. And I think if we look at the last government in the Netherlands, they had set themselves a very modest goal of 250 million reduction in tax expenditure, which I mean, we have a huge list of inefficient, sort of C-rated or D, what's sort of very badly rated, very inefficient tax expenditure. And even if you just want to...
Sorry, tax exemptions, right?
Yeah, sorry, tax exemptions, which in some cases, yeah, so tax exemptions and so you and then it's, if you reduce them, you can either sort of increase efficiency by giving it back to the people, or you keep the money, which is probably maybe what you need to do now. To be frank, I mean, the new government that we have also still needs to prove that they can make it work. I think the budget that they have set themselves is very clear, and they have chosen to put everything into the budget. I mean, and of course it's a stepwise approach, because you sort of gear up defense expenditure, and in the meantime you make the choices. But at least they're trying to make the choices now and communicate to the people. I personally really like sort of the safety tax, where you explain to people, sorry, we need to tax you a bit more, and and then you can also make the choice who is going to pay for this. Are you going to just distribute this evenly over the population, or are you going to make different choices? So I mean, there was at some point, and I know that we were in a higher growth environment back then, where the whole peace dividend sort of came to us, and where all the safety expenditure sort of went out of the budget. Relative to then, our welfare level has increased massively. So I would say political economy, I fully understand, but I'm not fully ready to sort of join you in the pessimism here.
Sorry, very quickly come back to you on this, because we spend a year analyzing the budget and thinking about how you can, reduce the structural need for expenditures, especially on the stuff you're talking about. It takes 10 years at least. You cannot just get rid of pensions. You have to do a pension reform, and then it's a stock, and then it will flow into it. You can do labor market reforms. You get more people in employment. You get, 10 billion if you do it well, but first you have to spend more, and then you get the reduction. So it just the magnitudes are so off.
To be frank, for me that's already half the work, and exactly what you should be doing. First of all, because you're ramping up expenditure, it's not 0 to 100 in one go. And second of all, because of what's happening now with the flexibility and the Stability and Growth Pact, this is sort of making things worse along the road. So you're having to do less right now, but it's building up the fiscal effort that you're going to have to do if you look at the rules later on. So this repeated game, Gilles, is really going to be a very tough game to play for a number of countries that are now massively using the exemptions. But if you do it now, then, that's the time when you will need it. So it's not that you cannot do anything currently. The whole point is setting up your future budget in time to ensure that you can absorb the increased structural costs of defense spending. And then you do indeed have some leeway also within the European budgetary rules to increase your debt levels a bit. And given sort of the cyclical aspects that Gilles explained, you're not running into the problem where your economy is not performing well right now and you need to adjust. So I think we're already much happier now with your explanation, in terms of making choices and doing choices now, even if they sort of have the benefits later on. Because that's the whole point. It's all a long-term projection of that sustainability, not sort of micromanaging the current deficits and that.
I'm afraid we're eating into your lunch break. Maybe if you have a very short comeback.
It was addressed to also me, and it was I take it's a hard trade-off. Actually, what the rule said is you have to take a medium-term approach, because this choice need time. And if you take SAFE, for instance, the deadline is 2030. So, but on the budgetary planning, you need a medium-term approach. And what you say also is there could be cases where you want to delay the moment where debt is put on the tipping point, is when you take investment and reform. You have the choice. It's not a golden rule, but you have the choice actually to delay. So, in a way, the fiscal rule allow you to buy time. But this time, both will materialize this higher debt. So, in a way, the rule does not prevent debt financing, but at some point, you need to see the tipping point, and that should be put on the downward path. If you take good reform, actually, it may help via also your denominator. But in a way, what you are saying is vindicated the medium-term approach of the rule, and the fact that the time where you have to put debt on the adjustment, the level of the adjustment, could be modulated if you take a reform which improves sustainability or a reform which are meeting the EU goals. So defense is one of the reform which is eligible indeed. But hard choice, that is show that there is a kind of unescapable arithmetic you have to face at some point. So the rule is actually just recalling a budgetary constraint and hard policy choice. But the rule allow also you could adjust with two plans basically in 7 years or with one plan, depending of the reform you put to the table.
Thank you so much. I invite you to continue over lunch break and to be back here at 2:15 for the next session. And thanks.